Starting. Okay, well, hi everyone.
It still says waiting for an Orthodox Apologetics channel. Oh no, here it is. It's starting right now.
Okay, well, hello everyone. This is the Orthodox Apologetics channel. I'm Deacon Joseph Swaden. I'm here with Hieromonk Enoch of the Abbey of the Holy Name, and we're going to cover basics of Orthodox Apologetics. We could talk about Hildebrand. It's all up to you, really, whatever you want to talk about. We're going to go through the basics until there are questions about Orthodox Apologetics or about teachings in Orthodoxy, etc. Father, anything to add to that? Or
no, let's get started.
Okay, so basically one of the things that we have to keep in mind, anything to add to that? Or hold on.
No, let's get started.
Give me 1 second, okay. Father. So I have to mute the YouTube screen. So, okay. In any case, part of the reason why I started writing rules, we were actually planning on doing that for a while, is because Orthodox Apologetics doesn't exactly work the same way that, say, apologetics in heterodox schools work. If you're a Protestant, it's basically memorization of the Bible and how that works, and ultimately there's a lot of subjectivism in it. When you're a Roman Catholic, it's actually very similar, and in that the fathers are proof texted in a very similar way to the way the scriptures are proof texted. Orthodox apologetics isn't just different, it has to be different, especially in the 20th century. What you notice is the people who do the most apologetics at the time are almost encyclopedic in their knowledge, and that is because you have to have an understanding of context. When it comes to the fathers, you read someone go, St. Augustine said this. You can't just assume St. Augustine actually said that unless you read the context of what he's saying. Father, I'm sure you want to add something to that.
No, keep on going.
Oh, well, okay. So let's go to, basically, I posted these on the War Room War Zone. I'm going to go through them piece by piece. I've posted a few rules. I haven't gone through all of them, but the main ones. And the first one, ultimate rule outside of all rules is that you have to have faith in God. You have to have faith in the church. And what that means is that people are going to try to shake your faith with this quote or that quote or this gotcha moment or that gotcha moment. You have to have faith. Jesus Christ established one church for men. And the point is that church is the true church. The answer's always there, even if you're not ready to give it. We're supposed to have a ready answer, and that's what apologetics training is about. But if you just get, accosted by a Jehovah's Witness and you don't have an answer, don't freak out. Have faith. The church always has the answer. With that, we'll go to the first rule of what I was referring to in terms of Orthodox apologetics, and that's context. I'm just going to read what I wrote. Get this word drilled in your mind. Every heterodox group on earth gets this wrong. Protestants don't understand biblical context. Roman Catholics don't understand patristic context or what a living tradition is. Context. If you see a quote, whether a scripture or a father, search for or demand its actual context.
Mm-hmm. Yes. For example, can you give us some examples of this, Father?
If you take any general apologetic against orthodoxy, the first thing you're going to notice is that they're quoting church fathers. Mm-hmm. And they quote them out of context. I mean, you've seen this literally countless times. It's almost every debate that we have on the War Room or the War Zone starts in exactly the same way. Some guy throws out a quote, and people begin debating it. But until you actually read the full context of the quote, guess what? You may not be even dealing with an honest understanding of what the quote meant.
Well, we all kind of recognize this when we deal with some Protestant individuals, not all, but some of them who say, call no man father, quoting from the gospel, our Lord's words.
Right.
And they say, you see, you can't call the priest father. Well, what's the context of it? Because the Apostle Paul talks about how he is a father. Though he says, though you have
father in the gospel in Christ.
Yeah, he says, though you have many teachers, you have not many fathers. So, or when the Apostle Paul was addressing the Sanhedrin in the book of Acts, he says, brothers and fathers. So we believe the Apostle Paul was inspired, so we don't believe he was going against our Lord's commandments. So the question then is, what's the context in which our Lord uttered the word, call no man father? the words.
Right. And so
Exactly.
now we take that to the next level, because we're looking at the scriptures, and that's answering Protestants. Take that to the next level with Roman Catholics. The assumptions that they make about what, say, for example, certain words mean, like the apostolic see.
Yes, like when St. Gregory says, I know of no see that's not subject to the apostolic see.
And how
Right.
many times have we seen that quoted?
It's there all the time. And the question is, what does subject mean? Because many Roman Catholics would upset and say, well, subject means you have to obey and do whatever it says, do whatever, the person is subject to. Well, ordinary bishops were subject to their metropolitans. All right. But a ruling bishop who is subject to a metropolitan see, this does not imply that the metropolitan can overrule the canonical decisions of a bishop in his own see. So subject does not mean slave. So there's a question of context there. So that's just two examples.
And not even to mention that it doesn't even go into the fact that the apostolic see is often referenced in a number of different ways. Rome is not the only one that's referred to as the apostolic see. The point is, you can find fathers where they're using the terms in ways that are very, very different from our understandings. And most of this is psychology.
St. Gregory, for example, St. Leo the Great even said, St. Gregory says it, Pope St. Gelasius says it, that the apostolic see is composed of what? They say Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. And that has to do with the Petrine concept of either St. Peter through St. Mark in Alexandria, or St. Peter dying in Rome, or St. Peter, in fact, being bishop or leader of the Church of Antioch at one point.
Exactly.
But we also should note that if you look in the letters of St. Cumian of Ireland, the abbot, who I think he passed away in the 630s, St. Cumian wrote a book to try to convince the Irish Church to accept the corrected Paschal calculation. There was this debate about how to calculate Pascha. And St. Cumian's, and the debates that happened in Ireland, there was something called the Synod of Magdalene in like 625 or so. And St. Cumian presented this kind of book. And by book, we don't mean like 500 pages. It was like maybe 40 pages. That's kind of how they thought of books, almost like a treatise.
Paper was expensive.
Exactly. And St. Cumian says that the four apostolic sees are Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So, they were even using the term apostolic see to refer to far more than just kind of the Petrine sees.
Well, that's why I say a lot of this is psychology, because if you're a convert from Roman Catholicism and it's been drilled in your head that the apostolic see is Rome and Rome alone, you're not going to understand the context. They're hoping that you will simply assume that the apostolic see means what they mean, and it doesn't.
Yes.
So this is why context is so important. Context basically gives you the fleshing out of what a father really meant. And the point is that process of learning what the fathers mean is part of acquiring an Orthodox mindset. It is, as much as I hate to say it, apologetics is, in my opinion, one of the best ways for somebody to really learn their orthodoxy. But it's been all but forgotten. It's enjoying a slight resurgence now, which is great, thank God. But the point is, after the 19th century, it went into abeyance, and now, well, got to bring it back.
Well, the question is, why did it go into abeyance?
Well, that of course that ties directly into the question of ecumenism, because the one thing that apologetics does is it forces people to ask questions, and the one thing that ecumenism does is it makes us stop asking questions. So I don't want to talk too much about ecumenism. I really want to focus on apologetics, but yeah, okay. Obviously it's definitely that's part of it, and that was the coming of the 20th century and what happened with that.
All right. Okay, so context. What's the second rule?
Okay, so we get to the second rule. Which I've lost. Give me 1 second. Because I lost my post. And I will go find it now. Give me one moment. Okay, so the second rule, understand and learn what the fathers teach. Do you have the rules in front of you?
Yes, I do.
I want you to read this one.
Okay, you are not to be afraid of reading the fathers. That's your responsibility. There are literally thousands of pages worth of Eastern and Western fathers. The responsibility of the Orthodox apologist is to know how to work through them. You don't have to know them all, but you should want to. If you cannot do this, you are not an Orthodox apologist. If you want to learn Orthodox apologetics, you must understand the fathers. Above all, you must understand the rudder and the councils of the church. If you are afraid to do this, then you should not be doing apologetics. It's okay. It's not for everyone.
Okay. Thoughts on this in terms of,
it's very common sense. I'm letting you take the lead on this, Father.
Well, the only reason I ask you on this is because you're well known as somebody who's read a lot.
Okay.
And that I don't want to minimize this. You can't go into apologetics without knowing the Father.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yes. If you just, for example, if somebody were to just take, let's say, Saint Gregory the Theologian or Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and they would only, they would read the Bible, just read Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and just go to church. You can learn a tremendous amount by reading Saint Gregory of Nyssa, the theologian. But there are going to be problems, and everybody kind of brings up St. Augustine, but you can do the same thing with St. Gregory of Nyssa when you just read one father like a St. Gregory of Nyssa, because you start to run into things like kind of the universalist controversy, Pogodin, I think it's called. You start to get these questions about the fire, supposedly purifying fire, and all this other stuff. And so if someone just was devoted to St. Gregory, then they would go away with some very wrong understanding of things. Just like if somebody was just reading St. Augustine, they would learn a lot of great things, but they would pick up a lot of erroneous and peculiar views. I think generally, though, a lot of teachers will say that if you read St. John Chrysostom, he's generally very balanced, that you get a lot of good information from him, but you should just read a lot of fathers. If you just read St. Irenaeus of Lyons believed in Chilianism. All right,
Chiliasm.
Yeah, the one that there would be a literal 1,000-year millennium as opposed to symbolic.
Well, a part of that is because of how early he was in the period,
Yes, but this is the point, that you have to have what's called the consensus of the fathers. And St. Vincent of Lorens talks about this in his Commonatory, that you bring up one or two or three or even a dozen fathers. What is that compared to 500, 1,000, the consensus of the church? And St. Photius brings this up in the Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit. And then, of course, there's the question, this also goes back to context about show me the quote. And I would also add, is the quote authentic? There's a manuscript question there, too. That gets into apologetics, too.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to understand the fathers. You have to, by reading them, because if you just let people write, if you just read an article about the fathers, or you read a book about the fathers, the problem is that you're getting a lot of times the interpretation of that person about the father that you're reading about.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't really understand them as they should be. Now, and it's not a bad idea to read the patristic text, and then if you want to read a study about them later, okay, go ahead and do that. But just reading a bunch of books printed by a seminary or whatever about, the church fathers or the Cappadocians, as opposed to actually reading them, you're going to learn far more by reading St. Gregory's Against Eunomius than you are by reading, a 500-page book that's analyzing it.
Yeah, and that's ultimately it's the question is: are you reading the fathers, or are you reading someone's thesis paper?
Exactly. The pedalion. You mentioned the rudder. We should try to know the rudder. The rudder, for those who don't know, is also called the pedalion. It's a large volume, and it contains the canons of the ecumenical councils and the canons of the universally approved local councils. And it contains some canons of the individual fathers at the very back of it. It's very important to know, for example, if you're debating, again, Roman Catholics or those who care about, for example, the papacy, the canons of Sardica, about how they give the papacy the right to do, under certain instances for like kind of a review of a case. But Roman Catholics will point to this, but then they ignore the context of this is the council is actually giving this as a right, or it might say a privilege, as opposed to it being, I think they say we give this in memory of St. Peter or something like that.
Right, yeah.
So that's
the memory of St. Peter.
Exactly. So and this is part of the problem, if people just talk about the canons, but they actually don't read them, and they don't understand the context of the canons, that goes back to point one, context. then you're going to make a lot of mistakes. One of the things St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain talks about in his commentary in the Pedalion is how a lot of people were misunderstanding the directives of many of the canons and their penalties. A lot of canons say, if a bishop or priest does this, the penalty is for them to be deposed, or let them be deposed, or let them be suspended.
Right.
And St. Nicodemus points out that a lot of people misunderstand this. It has to be juridically enforced by a synod, which means that if somebody is, let's say, ordained and they pay the bishop $1,000 to make them a priest, they are still a priest, although they are in grave sin.
Now, I'd like to throw something out there, and
that's an example of context. Even in the canons, you have to understand the context of the canons, because if you don't, you just take one canon out of context, you can use that to, condemn even saints, which is not what they were meant for.
Well, what I was going to point out, because let's face it, the Rudder is a big book. First off, even if you read the entire Pedalion, you know the rules. You're not a canon lawyer. And what I mean by that is there's a lot more to it, because each of those canons has been interpreted different ways. For starters, for people who are just beginning in terms of trying to understand the canonical rule of orthodoxy, there's something called the Ancient Epitome. It was actually, it was written, not exactly even...
11th, 12th century.
Right. And what that is basically, it's a summary. Now, to give you an idea of what that is, they're back in my day, and this is just showing how old I am, I remember Reader's Digest used to have this thing called You and the Law. And what it was a book written for your average American to know the basic laws of the United States without becoming a lawyer. They don't have to know all the details, but, just to know what's legal, what's not, what you can handle. I would suggest, if anyone is a little afraid of tackling the Pedalion, start with the Ancient Epitome. And that way you can get a sense of what the church's general rules are. It's like carrying a copy of the Constitution in your pocket, and you don't need to be an expert on everything. But if you know something as simple as the Ancient Epitome, it allows you to go deeper when you need to. Somebody calls you out on a canon, you can quickly go back to the Rudder, and you can learn that. So there are, the church has actually developed tools to make it easier so that, people can really know their laws, their rules, and their canons.
Yes, absolutely. So context, and then understanding and learning what the fathers teach, as opposed to reading what people say about the fathers. That's an important point. And reading the canons or the councils, the decrees of the councils, as opposed to what people say the councils or the canons say or decree. Okay, point 3 would be background information. So point 3 of Orthodox Apologetics is background information, correct or not, is not the same as context. When a quote is shown, it is a quote from something. If you ask for context and a person responds with, well, this was /happened /means, then that is not context. Context is literally the surrounding verbal material to a quote. Can you elaborate on that, Father?
Actually, I think you actually did, because if what we were talking about with the thesis papers, reading the fathers, etc., this is exactly what I mean. Somebody quotes from it, and I mean, I'm not going to point fingers at any particular Roman Catholic apologists or any Protestant apologists.
Well, Orthodox do this too.
Well, so yeah, they do, because they read they read it, and that's not apologetics. They read there's a quote of a father, and then they start looking at the background that the author of the thesis paper wrote. That doesn't necessarily answer what the father meant. It simply answers what the author's point was.
Or like what oftentimes happens, there will be a discussion and someone will say, here's a book written by Father John so-and-so or Father Michael so-and-so.
Right.
All right. And they'll say, here's what he says. Answer what he says. Well, do I really need to answer some modern interpreter or do I need to answer a patristic argument?
Exactly.
You see what I mean? I think that's a problem. And people get upset because they are taught to assume, because this person has an academic degree of some sort, that they automatically know more than everybody else, and that they have more gravitas and authority. Whereas in Orthodoxy, as far as I understand, that is not how we are supposed to think.
No.
Now that people think like that, but that's not how we're supposed to think. You have, people like Saint Seraphim of Seraph, who was learned in the Holy Scriptures and in the Fathers, even though he had no formal education, and he was enlightened by the Holy Spirit. I mean, this is the whole thing about the Holy Elders, and yet Saint Seraphim, I think he may have had a small formal education because he was made a priest in Russia, but it was nothing like a PhD or anything. But, this is how you have cases of, holy elders that are able to, for example, there's the, this is kind of a controversial thing, but there was the whole case in the early 20th century. There was a kind of a controversial Greek writer, a religious writer, and he went to visit this one elder on the Holy Mountain back in like 1910 or something like that. And they were arguing. He was arguing with the elder in confession about saying he wasn't giving the correct type of penances and things. Because this Greek writer was like, I've read the Pedalion and I know I've read the, different penitential books. And the elder said, well, look, if you don't agree with me, I can't force you, all right. And the story is that, I know it's kind of off topic, is he was walking down the mountain and he fell over and broke his leg and he later died. And the reason you kind of read this in some spiritual literature is not to say that, not to kind of generate this cultic elder following, but to say that if you have an attitude where you have a doctorate, you're a professor of theology or whatever, and that means you know more automatically than someone who's 90 years old, has been a monk since they've been 16 years old, has a, that you have a pride issue there, and so this is why, we always should be careful. Not that academic studies, they can be useful, but they are, after all, academic studies, not the writings of the fathers and not the writings of the saints.
Well, I think that actually brings us back to an important point, because as we talk about learning in terms of learning the fathers and so on and so forth, and we have to remember the basic purpose of apologetics is to provide an answer for the true faith and to bring people to Christ. And if we lose that focus, if it becomes, gotcha arguments, I remember when I started on this journey, I was debating with a Roman Catholic apologist over the phone, back when the phone was really a big thing. And the point is, at one point, I felt bad for somebody that I was arguing with in an email. And I was like, he basically said, I could demolish this argument. I don't want to, because this person sounds like they're really shaking. And you don't want to mess with somebody's mental state. And he's like, no, you have to win. That's what's important. But winning is not always important if you're going to destroy someone's faith. If you see a person who has faith and it's misdirected, your job is to help them redirect it. It's not to, destroy it. And the point is that it's a dangerous place, because when you are studying Orthodox apologetics the proper way, you are learning everything about the church. And you should use it in the way the church intends, which is to save souls. If you use it to win, then what happens is you destroy yourself. And we are to avoid using apologetics to beat people over the head just to say, I won the argument. Yeah.
What's the use in winning the argument, but then you lose your own soul because you've committed deadly mortal sin, as the fathers say, by going into pride and, rejoicing in, the triumph and all the rest.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well,
it reminds me of who was it? I think it was St. Gregory of Tours. I forget which of the fathers in the Vita Patrum. It might have been, I want to say Kevin of Glendalough, but I know I'm wrong. But it was one of the fathers. It might have been St. Martin, now that I think about it. He had just healed someone. And he was on his horse. He had, I guess, prayed and the person was healed. And then, he thought for just a moment, wow, through the power of God, I healed this person. And we would normally think that's not a big deal. But the reality was, he was thinking still himself. And when he thought himself, his horse threw him off.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep, absolutely. So do not assume. I'm sorry, I almost jumped. Background information. We have to have not just the context, but we have to have all the surrounding material that we're dealing with in apologetics. Let's just go ahead to Rule 4.
Okay.
Rule 4 says, do not assume something means what an interlocutor says it means unless you have full context. Virtually all pointless arguments over single quotes, no one should ever argue over isolated quotes, come from not having the context of the father in question. Always ask for at least a full translation. Now, I believe this is useful because oftentimes you see quotes and they have like ... Mm-hmm. And you have remember the whole discussion we had years, 2 years ago, over Saint Maximus the Confessor and the papacy. That was the very first discussions we were having on the Orthodox Apologetics War Room.
Yeah.
And there was this long ellipsis over in the works of St. Maximus, the Confessor.
Right.
And we were like, that's interesting. And if you read the text with all these ellipses and words missing, it can be interpreted in a kind of a more authoritative, power to the Pope or whatever.
Right.
But if you read the full context and we had to translate those ellipses, or we had to find Greenwood's work where he translated. It was a big task just to find everything.
Yeah, but once we did,
it made perfect sense. It was all about getting the permission. It was some legal argument about getting permission for a consecration certificate, and it had nothing to do with what they were trying to say it had to do.
Well, I'll tell you, and again, that's an extreme form of it. And this is, maybe I'll add this to the rules. I don't know, but I think I should. Always be suspicious of an ellipsis.
Yes.
It tells you not only a lot about what's missing, it tells you a lot about the person who's doing the translating. I was amazed, and I'm gonna mention something that's much simpler than that. But there was remember that there was the whole the rite of brother making that was used in certain points, and this became an argument that it was like a pro-gay marriage rite. But this was about 15 years ago. But in any case, the alleged translator who found this rite, so on and so forth, it would say, the rite of brother making began with, things, basic things. So it began like, holy God, holy mighty, but it literally said holy God and then ... which everyone would assume because that ... was in, the text. And so the assumption is, well, holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. But he literally put a question mark there because he had no idea what that meant. So this meant that the person who was supposedly translating this, the supposed authority, did not understand the basics of what an Orthodox prayer was. That tells you they probably don't understand the text they're reading, and they probably shouldn't be making inferences from it. So the point is, when you see ellipses, you should always be suspicious, because ellipses can be used to hide things, and liturgical ellipses are used to indicate something that is obvious to an Orthodox Christian. So it tells you what type of people you're dealing with. Now, in patristic texts, we see the ... everywhere. We see it with, in Roman Catholic texts all the time. And the point is, usually once you fill in the blank, it doesn't say what they meant. That brings us to a point, because a lot of the quotes and quotations and rewrites, they're like basically Jurgens, and then they basically go back to Chapman. But the point is, there's like this corpus of terribly quoted texts that are constantly used over and over and over again.
Yep. Well, remember, during the Protestant Reformation / Revolt, the same thing happened where Protestants would assemble quotations from the Fathers to prove, the Lutheran or the Calvinist. They actually, in fact, we don't think of Protestants as doing this now, but they in fact did this a whole lot in the 1550s. And so they would assemble dozens of quotations supposedly demonstrating how the Fathers did not believe in the transformation of the holy gifts in the liturgy, all right? That they believed in a symbolic interpretation or something like that. But if you read all these quotations they assembled, they were almost always out of context. Or they would bring up something St. Augustine said in one of his sermons, where he said that we do not have a butcher shop theology in regards to the Eucharist. And they, take that to mean St. Augustine didn't believe in the real presence. But it's ridiculous. What St. Augustine was saying was that when the priest takes the lamb, the body of the Lord, and he fractures it in the Eucharist, that he is not tearing the flesh of Christ apart in the same sense as when Christ was on the earth. Remember, in the liturgy of St. Chrysostom, I'm Western Rite, so I'm trying to remember this. There's a point where the priest divides the body of the Lord, and he says, broken is the Lamb of God, divided but never separated. I think if that's correct.
That's correct.
Yes. And that's supposed to be teaching a theological point, that there is an objective real presence there. We can use, and you even use the term transubstantiation if we understand that we're not going for all the Thomistic things, but that the outward appearance can, be broken, but it's still the real presence there. That in each particle of the Eucharist, as it says in Decree 17 of the Synod of Jerusalem, is the entire Christ. All right? So this was an example of people taking, and even the modern translator, one of the modern translators of St. Augustine, I cannot remember his name. He was this former Jesuit, Gary something or another. Gary Wills or something. Yeah,
I haven't kept up on the recent Jesuits, so
yeah, well, he was a former. He left. He was even too liberal for them.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I know. But he wrote these books about trying to show that St. Augustine didn't believe in the sacrifice of the Mass, the real presence, and he's forcing interpretations. So even translators themselves, they may be good Latin translators, but that doesn't mean they're good commentators.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful. Even someone who translates a text. I mean, I have a number of books on my bookshelves that are translations of 8th and 9th century text. One of them is a translation of the Annals of St. Bertin from the 9th century, and they talk about a synod held in around the year 882 in France, in which the synod basically refuses to obey a kind of an injunction by Pope John VIII and other Roman bishops to give the primacy of Gaul to another see. And they say that this is against the canons. If the Pope commands something contrary to the canons and the councils, we don't have to obey him. All right? But if you look at like a little note at the very bottom by the translator, they say, well, of course, they didn't really mean it like that. They just meant this is all just theater. Well, if you look at the whole book and you look at the surrounding context, the reason the commentator says that, this translator, is because they're assuming that the ultramontane position was held in France even in the 80s. But even though the actual synodal text rebuts that. So there's almost like a cognitive dissonance going on there.
Yeah, no, definitely. By the way, somebody has just written something here. Aristotle Theophilus, hi. Hello, fathers. Could you please address the current Ukraine issue that is occurring?
Okay. Do you want us to go through? Should we go through the last rule and then address the Ukraine issue, Father?
We can go to the last rule later.
Okay. All right. Let's address the Ukraine issue then. Go ahead.
Why not? Okay. Well, first off, I guess this was the Patriarch of Moscow saying Happy New Year. It was kind of a shock for even us. I'm still trying to process it, but it would appear that you have to come at it from two different angles. The first angle you have to look at is, first off, does the ecumenical patriarchate have the power to universally assign patriarchates? And then the second one, which is a legitimate question, is one that, and this is one that addresses, the whole point is of what Moscow is doing is that they're basically claiming that the Patriarch of Constantinople is acting like a pope. And for this...
You remember the article on that website called The Apotheosis of Eastern Papism.
Right. And the whole point is, if we go into the canons, basically, bishops have canonical territory. And so the debate here and the real argument is whether the Patriarch of Constantinople can make an autocephalous church out of someone else's territory. The answer to that question in general canonically has been no. At least as I know, unless you want to add something to that. Father.
No, I don't think it's ever been a case that could be done. In fact, this is not something new that Constantinople has suddenly come up with in the past 5, 10, or 20 years.
Oh, no.
I don't think people recall this, but the Church of Georgia, the Georgian Church, was originally made autocephalous by the Patriarch of Antioch back in the 600s.
Yeah.
Right. Now it's kind of around the 12th century there was a Muslim invasion, or maybe the 13th century, and kind of the Tomos got destroyed. All right, and so in the 1980s there was talk among some of the ecumenical patriarchate hierarchs that only the Fanarch can grant autocephaly, so Georgia isn't really autocephalous. Even though everybody had acknowledged it as autocephalous. Anyway, of course, there's more to the background because Russia did try to abolish the autocephaly back in the 1815s, and everybody acknowledged that that's wrong. So the Georgian Church was convinced to send a representative to the Fanar to confirm its autocephaly. All right, so the Fanar kind of has this bad attitude of going around to people to get them to accept either their chrism or to issue documents. And in the Ukraine situation, I know this is kind of this is related, but the person of Filaret Didasenko, and we've dealt with him before. We've, us personally and throughout jurisdiction, we've dealt with him, going back to the 1990s. He is, I hate to use personal aspersions, but he is not a nice man. All right. I think
you're going to have to clarify that a bit.
Okay. Well, back in the 1980s, Didasenko was the one responsible when he was head of the Moscow Patriarchate, Exarch in Ukraine, for basically clearing out monasteries, expelling monks. For him to be Metropolitan of Kiev in the 1980s in the Moscow Patriarchate, basically the second highest position in the Patriarchate at that point, he had to not just cooperate with Soviet authorities, he had to be a Soviet authority.
Yeah.
What happened ultimately is he wanted to be patriarch. He was second in running. Remember, Alexius II got elected after Patriarch Pimen died, I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm.
If I'm getting that correctly. And it looked like Filaret was going to win. He was going to be patriarch, and he lost. And he lost to Alexei II. And at that point, I guess he decided, if I can't be patriarch of Moscow, I'll be Patriarch of Kiev. Well, the problem was there was already someone claiming to be Patriarch of Kiev, Mstislav Skripnik.
Yep, right.
And Mstislav did not, and they ignore this. This is the weird thing about the Kievan Patriarchate. They're erasing their own history. That Mstislav did not like Filaret. Nobody liked Filaret. All right? Filaret created his own organization initially. He was trying to get a kind of accord with Mstislav's group. Mstislav did not want to interact with him. All right. But Mstislav, like the last 2 years, he couldn't really do a lot. He was kind of dying, basically. He was like 95 or something. And so.
Didn't he die in South Downbrook?
Yeah, he did. He kind of went to Ukraine a little bit. And see, there's a lot of controversy over this whole subject. But anyway, so Mstislav dies. The Kievan Patriarchate, the nascent organization, has kind of an election. And in the election, they have two candidates. One is Vladimir Romaniuk, who was previously known as Father Vasily Romaniuk, who was kind of a famous dissident. He was in like the camps in the 60s and 70s, and things. And he kind of like he was expelled from. He was allowed to leave or whatever from the Soviet Union in the 70s, and he was like a big human rights activist against the Bolsheviks and things. And he kind of came back to Ukraine, and he was a bishop in this kind of nascent Kievan Patriarchate before Filaret took it over. So Filaret has his own organization. He joins it. There's a big controversy because people don't want to deal with Filaret. Even the Ukrainian autocephalists don't like him initially because a lot of them who live there knew what he was involved in.
Now, we should, because keep in mind that a lot of our listeners might not know this, that there is a background with the whole Ukrainian autocephalous church that goes all the way back, I think, to 1921.
Yeah, you see, and the problem, and let's be frank here, even if you're sympathetic to having an autocephalous Ukrainian church, the original way they tried to do it back in 1921 was insane. They did the whole dead hands consecration.
Okay. For those who don't know, basically they had one bishop who was going to do a consecration, even if it was single-handed. Well, he died, and so then they used his dead hand. He was propped up in the throne. And they put him on an archimandrite, his hand, and they have an archimandrite read this. I mean, he was insane. Well, he wasn't insane. He was dead. They were insane.
Well, no, they were insane. That's exactly how they did it. Well, and as a result, a lot of the other Ukrainians, even like the Mstislav Skripnik and a few others in the 30s, are like, we don't want to be associated with this.
Right.
And even if they were favoring, because they had enough knowledge to know this is a lot of this is crazy. Now, most of those bishops, they're not, so-called, were killed in the 20s and 30s by Stalin anyways. So the original autocephalous organization, was destroyed. And anybody who wanted to remain had to be reordained to the Moscow Patriarchate, which is basically what happened in the 30s and the 40s. But then in the 40s, the early 1940s, when the Soviets, around 1939-40, when the Soviets and the Germans invade Poland, I know this is old history, but we have to understand it to understand the Ukrainian situation. When this happened... Okay, I'm trying. Okay, so what has happened is that the Soviets take basically what we call Eastern Poland, all right? And they kind of add that to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, all right? and the Germans take, the western area and the central area of Poland and such. Well, when the Germans then invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, they eventually basically conquer most of Ukraine, going up in the European Russian. So what happens is a lot of bishops, kind of Moscow Patriarchate bishops, kind of declare the Ukrainian autonomous Orthodox Church, which is kind of like one step below, being autocephalous.
Right, yeah.
And they still claim they're commemorating the Patriarch of Moscow, but they basically say, we commemorate Sergius, but we don't want to do anything he says because he's a puppet, basically, And they kind of ally with something called the revived autocephalous church, which was kind of had bishops made by them by the Polish Orthodox Archbishop of Krakow, Dionysi. All right, and they kind of have this communion agreement and all this other stuff. Well, when 44 and 45 roll around, needless to say, a lot of these people leave Ukraine because the Soviets are reconquering it. All right. Now, some of those autonomous and autocephalous bishops join various groups afterward. For example, Archbishop Leonti of Chile of the Russian Church abroad, who I guess passed away in the 70s, he was originally consecrated a bishop back in 44 in this attempt to create an autonomous Ukrainian church. All right. And so he, some of them, join different groups. So, there are a lot of these people, like the autocephalists, who have correct consecrations, are kind of waiting to come back. And they come back. Mstislav kind of sets up an organization. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of destruction happening. He dies. Volodymyr and Filaret are then the competitors, become patriarch. Volodymyr wins, and Volodymyr Romaniuk defeats Filaret in the election, basically because he was popular in Ukraine. People knew he was not a Soviet apparatchik. They put him in the camps. He was tortured. And for whatever anyone wants to say, he wasn't tortured just for plain Ukrainian nationalism.
Yeah.
They were asking him to renounce God and, deny Christ. They were doing all kinds of horrible things, So he becomes the head of the Kievan Patriarchate. Well, immediately problems begin to happen. Filaret is very upset that he is not, because he broke with Moscow so he could become head of another group. Right. And he doesn't even get that. Well, he forces, at this kind of sobor the Ukrainians have, that he gets to be recognized as deputy patriarch. That was the compromise. Because he said, if you don't do this, I'm going to cause us another schism. I'm going to cause a lot of trouble. And there's a lot of impetus from the Ukrainian authorities to try to just patch over things. Well, problems begin to, continue to arise. And, and near the end, like the last 2 years of Volodymyr Romaniuk's time as head of the Kievan Patriarchate, he's actually asking for protection by the Ukrainian police from Filaret Denisenko. He's getting harassing phone calls, death threats, and we know who's doing this. All right. And eventually Volodymyr Romaniuk is found dead in a park by, two anonymous women that were never really told who they were. They supposedly waited like an hour to call the ambulance. His ribs were broken. They tried to later claim that this was their attempt to revive him, but he had a lot of bruising. He had blood coming out of his chest. I mean, there were things going on. And I'll give you one thing. The Russian Wikipedia is, in fact, they made a point, because of their anti-Kievan patriarch, of getting all the news articles on this subject. Whereas the Ukrainian Wikipedia is like kind of not talking about some of this stuff.
And the English Wikipedia has no clue.
And English Wikipedia doesn't care at all. And there were some other issues, and but the point is that Filaret wanted to be head of his group. He did not like Volodymyr. In fact, it wasn't until like last year that they even tried to take care of Volodymyr's grave. They claimed they couldn't take care of it because it was outside of St. Sophia's. Well, that's not right, because they had legal rights to the grave. Filaret wanted to pretend he was the creator of everything. He didn't want to have anybody else as a past. The Kievan Patriarchate becomes about Filaret. And the Ukrainian authorities, frankly, are willing to use him just like he's willing to use them. So you're not dealing with a sincere and honest man here.
Well,
right?
With that in the background, now we have to simply look at the question of, okay, so we have Filaret Denisenko with a very checkered past. And
that's an understatement, checkered past. Okay.
Yeah, okay. It's an understatement. We'll say check his past. But anyway, the point is, the point I'm trying to make is that now, basically what he's done is he's gone to Constantinople. And Constantinople, and this is where we have to go into the whole question of the Eastern Papacy. This is a very new idea. What I don't know when this was.
Well, remember, just to drop in here for a second. The Fanar had given a previous deal to Filaret Denisenko, I think in 2016 or early 2017. They had given him an earlier deal. And the earlier deal was they would recognize him as like an autonomous metropolitan under the Fanar. All right? Something so almost like how Metropolitan Nufrius of the Moscow Patriarchate is in relation to Moscow.
Right.
Denisenko, and he didn't want that, and neither did the Ukrainian authorities. And just so we understand, a lot of money has exchanged hands between Kiev under Poroshenko? Poroshenko's the president, correct?
Yeah.
And the Fanar. I think there was something reported recently that between $8 to $15 million was given by the Kievan government to the Fanar. And there's a lot of money subtext going behind this, not just papal kind of neo-patriarchal papalism that is there, but these people kind of know how to use everything. I mean, a lot of them are CIA type people to begin with, you know. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was simply pointing out that in that background, effectively, to answer Aristotle's original question, Filaret is a useful tool, but is Moscow justified in breaking communion with them? If someone, you know, as one of their writers on orthochristian.ru wrote, this is no longer a question of canonical integrity, it's a question of someone breaking into your house.
Yes.
And so I think that's the basic answer, at least for me. Father, if you want to add to that.
Well, I mean, to some extent, we're kind of outsiders looking at it, but you know, I'm trying to answer in as objective sense as possible about giving the information and giving the scenarios we're being presented. How would we react if a similar thing was done? And and frankly, as much as I don't like things that Kirill and I don't like Kirill and Hilarion, I you know, but in an objective sense, it has to be admitted that you know
they're right.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're not. They're right. It's like you have to admit someone you don't like is right, but maybe they're not right for all the right reasons. But they're right on this subject.
They're right on this one.
Exactly.
From a canonical standpoint, they're right on that. And unfortunately, that's now the biggest thing that I've noticed is a lot of people are kind of like, well, but everyone's still in communion, right? Sort of.
Okay, so recently the Moscow Patriarchate Synod passed a decision, and the decision says that there will be no concelebrations between the hierarchs of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That clergy, lower clergy of the Greek Patriarchate, which is the Ecumenical Patriarchate, can, on some occasions, which is an interesting phrase, concelebrate with Moscow Patriarchate clergy. Now, this is mentioned basically in reference to Mount Athos, because you have the Russian monasteries of Mount Athos, and you have the Ecumenical Patriarch, which is technically in charge of Mount Athos.
And all the monasteries were.
Exactly. And so they're in this situation where there's no hierarchical concelebrations. Lower clergy concelebrations can happen, but under supervision. There doesn't seem to be any distinct rules other than the laity between the two groups can go back and forth, but that's as much as unrestricted communion they're going to have between the laity.
Right.
All right. Now, they do say that the next step would be the full rupture of Eucharistic communion. So now remember, about 3 days ago on Tuesday, not many people noticed this. In the Russian media, it was actually a big thing. Not many in the English-speaking world. I didn't speak. I think I was the only one who actually mentioned it in some comments somewhere, because I kind of follow the Russian religious media. When Patriarch Kirill did the liturgy, like on Tuesday, at the great entrance, he gave this generic, and remember, this is before the official breaking of commemoration with the Fanar happened. He gave this a generic commemoration saying all the Holy Orthodox Patriarchs. Whereas in reality, he's supposed to be basically naming what we call the diptychs, or in a certain sense, you know, Patriarch of Constantinople, Patriarch of Alexandria, supposed to go through their names of all the heads of the kind of autocephalous groups that he accepts. Well, he didn't do any of that. He just said all the Holy Orthodox Patriarchs. All right, which is interesting, because the only people who used to do that were kind of like non-commemorator types.
Right. Well,
right?
now this is interesting.
I think the Row Corps I used to do something like that too back in the 80s.
Yeah, and well, I think that what's happening is, and now they settled that. I don't know if you saw that, but they settled.
Well, now they're going to mention whoever the guy, the head of Alexandria is,
Patriarch
Parthenius or something like that.
Exactly.
Because technically he's next after Constantinople, so they're essentially not going to mention Constantinople. It's just going to be Alexandria. So the reason the generic commemoration was done to begin with was they did not want to mention Bartholomew, but they didn't want to openly not mention him. So there was this kind of vague intermediate stage where they can say, well, we are commemorating the Holy Orthodox Patriarchs, and if Bartholomew had said, well, why didn't you mention me? They could always say, well, aren't you one of the Holy Orthodox Patriarchs? Kind of like a question mark,
right.
reply. So
now now if we look at this from the flip side, because we have to, ultimately, if we're talking about what Russia's future actions are going to be, they're going to be based on effectively when the Filaret Denisenko is enthroned as Patriarch of Kiev, and let's talk a little bit about what's that going to look like.
What do you mean exactly?
Well, first off, we know that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is supporting this. They're behind it 100%.
Yeah, and remember, the history of the Uniates in Ukraine has always been negative. It's never been a positive thing. I mean, the whole reason the Greek Catholic Church was created in the 1590s was, essentially to it was a toll not just of the Vatican, but of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And they wanted to conquer Russia. And remember, at one point, they actually, during the time of troubles, they actually got up to even controlling Moscow. The other point to make is among the Greek Catholics, a lot of them are the ones, kind of the most hostile toward, Russia.
Yeah.
And this is interesting. Now, I think someone pointed out a few weeks ago that the whole connection between Ukrainian nationalism and the Greek Catholics is kind of not as settled as someone might think. Because for a long time, the Vatican had the Greek Catholics through the Vatican had a policy of not necessarily endorsing Ukrainian nationalism in the 19th century. And that's because they felt it was divisive and it would make the Russian state not like them. The Vatican's original plan was to take over the Russian Empire by converting a czar, and then the czar would enforce the Unia upon the Orthodox. All right, so they would kind of have a Russian Greek Catholic Church, which they actually do have, But what happened is in the early 20th century, that didn't really go as planned. The Russian Empire collapses, and the Vatican always has like kind of a second plan, you might say.
It's a redundancy.
Exactly. So at that point, the Vatican actually begins to try to establish diplomatic relations with the Bolsheviks, which even other countries in the West weren't even trying to do. The Greek Catholic Church revives. Ukraine becomes an independent state. Now, when Ukraine became an independent state in 1917, 18, and 19, we have to remember it was not the same size as it is now. It did not contain Crimea. It did not contain what we call Eastern Ukraine, like the Lushansk, Donbass, that whole area. It did not even contain the areas we think of as Western Ukraine. It was kind of this middle state. And initially it had like a hetman. There was one of the hetmans that was trying to head it. They had like their own president, but there was, and even Metron Anthony Karpovitsky, who was kind of the leader of the Row Corps, was kind of supportive because it was anti-Bolshevik. You know what I mean? And so he was supporting kind of this one hetman, and Metron Anthony Karpovitsky actually said at the 1917 there was a Russian Great Council they had, that he would not, in theory, be opposed to autocephaly, but it has to be done the right way. All right? So, but the point is, the Greek Catholics, they've always been trying to cause trouble. To them, Ukrainian nationalism is a tool to basically attack Orthodoxy.
Well, I'm not trying to sound ecumenical here, but to be fair, even though they tried to make a deal with the Bolsheviks killed them too.
Oh, I know. I mean, you're dealing with different parties that are not going to be necessarily, they all have their own agendas in the background. Yeah. It wasn't like the Vatican was necessarily controlled by the Bolsheviks. The Vatican is going to make deals with anybody if they can make a deal with it.
Yeah.
But it continues, and there were problems in the early 1990s. For example, there was an interview I was reading in which Volodymyr Romaniuk was very negative to the Greek Catholics. I mean, not personally, but a lot of Ukrainians, even if they were autocephalous, didn't necessarily like the Greek Catholics. Now, that attitude has changed during the time of Filaret, because what's become the fact is an overarching Ukrainian nationalism, kind of a pan-Ukrainian ecumenism, all right? Where if you're Ukrainian, that's all that really matters. And so Filaret has gone to the point of, trying to endorse consecrating a joint temple with the Uniates and all the rest. So
I want to emphasize that point, because this big enthronement that they're having, this is something that is going to be supported by Rome. This is something that's going to be supported by the Ukrainian Greek Catholics. One of the things we have to understand, just like in Orthodox Apologetics, we talk about psychology. When you're looking at news and stuff like that, keep in mind optics.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that... Go ahead.
What are the optics?
Well, the whole point is they're going to try to explain this as something very deep, that this is a great union of the country, everyone's happy. And so, the whole point is, in the Western media and the Eastern media, this is going to look very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the Western media, they're going to... I can already imagine the CNN and Fox News stories about a country once divided is now united, or something like that. And I mean, it'll be ridiculous. And that's how they're going to portray it. And now there's even been talk. Now again, we're being put in a position where we're having to kind of sympathize with, at least on an individual level, what's going to happen to even Moscow Patriarchate people in Ukraine.
Yeah,
because there's been talk about making illegal the Moscow Patriarchate organization in Ukraine. Exactly. Now I know this has been happening in other places to people like us. Maybe it will, who knows? Maybe it will generate, some, much more fairer legislation in other places. But, and I think that to a great extent, kind of the Ukrainian government, they don't care about theology. All right. They don't care about the canons. It's just about, we have our own church, whatever that means by church,
Mm-hmm.
And come hell or high water, they're going to do it, and Filaret's more than welcome. I mean, he's collaborated with the Ukrainian government consistently. They have their own plans, each of them, and I don't know what more to say on the Ukraine situation.
I think we've summed it up pretty much. That if we look at it from a canonical standpoint, Moscow's right. We don't know what's going to happen, and we can look and see possibly into a window of what is.
Well, let's talk about the possibilities of. We have
another question.
Okay, what's the other question?
Derwood Johnson writes, I just read The Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ by St. Maximus the Confessor, and I'm wondering, are the logoi similar to Plato's forms? Can you give examples of how the logos and logoi relate to, and I don't know if he wanted to write more on that.
I've not read the book called The Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ. I've seen it. I've not read it. Okay. I did read the chapters on love by St. Maximus, and I have read a few of his other works. And I'm not an expert in this, so I think there are some other people who may. It would be great if we could bring on people eventually on the show that could answer questions like this. Well,
I'm not going to.
All I think is that when we make comparisons between Plato and the theology of the church, we have to be very careful.
No,
because there can be similarities in terms and to some kind of similarities in terminology and an idea, but if you're talking about things that exist in the mind of God, and have existed forever, then that's something uncreated.
Well, I actually was going to point out that basically, again, I'm going to just flat out say I have not read the book that he's talking about. And the problem that I'm having here is when you say, I'm wondering, are the logoi similar to Plato's forms? In this, we have to look at how Plato himself sees the forms. Because Platonism, and this is one of the biggest problems that I think, honestly, converts are have in Orthodoxy, it's a common thing, is to present Orthodox teaching as a baptism of Platonic ideas. And that's not really true. What's happening is that they're employing language because if you know the history of the Fathers, St. Basil talks about how, like, you're supposed to take the best of that in human philosophy and, you pick the best fruit from the tree. The whole point is that when you start saying things like, are the logoi similar to Plato's forms, you've already lost the plot. And I'm not trying to be insulting, but what I mean by that is that Plato's forms were not describing, the manifestation of Christ. They were not describing the divine energies as we as Christians understand them. So the question becomes, how are they similar to Plato's forms? What was Plato defining? And then once we can look at that, we can see, does it have a similitude to what the church teaches? Because that's the way we're always supposed to look at it. That's the way the Fathers looked at it. So it's, and I'm not gonna point to a specific YouTuber or anything like that who, basically spends a lot of time in Platonism and then is trying to adopt orthodoxy within that framework. But we should be reading the Fathers as they are, and not trying to degrade them into human philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably something that we could talk about more, but I'd want to get more information before saying anything
Absolutely.
else.
And I hope that, Derwood, I hope you have more questions. I hope we can answer them.
I must confess that in Orthodox Apologetics, I deal much more with historical questions.
But I think that's the right way to go.
And historical questions are related to theology because theology is in history. So there's no way to extract those. But I deal more with questions about, what, the councils and, what was done then and all the rest.
Well, actually, I would agree with you. But more importantly, I would say that that's the correct way to do apologetics, is that it's supposed to be a focus on history. And the reason that I say that is because of the fact that a lot of Thomistic argument that you find in Roman Catholicism, so on and so forth, is really an adoption of Platonic philosophy.
Well, they give abstract argumentation in many cases, where they want to argue. They want to argue on the merits, whereas the Orthodox way, and this is what's unappealing to some people, and it's appealing to me though. Orthodox apologetics traditionally has been having a lot of references to the Fathers. Mm-hmm. All right, and these are authoritative sources. Now, if you look at Aquinas, or other, he'll make arguments about why St. John of Damascus is wrong, or why Maimonides is right. And people have pointed this out for years.
Using this kind of twisted logic.
Exactly. Now, it should also be noted that a lot of Aquinas quotes are actually, interpolated quotes from the Latin and the Greek Fathers.
Oh, they even interpolate.
Even there, he doesn't like. I think there was one work of Aquinas in which something like 90% of the quotations from the Fathers later turned out to be interpolated. And people also forget they used to be like books. For example, there supposedly was a whole chapter of the City of God from the 12th century manuscript that was just invented about. It was endorsing like unleavened bread and things like that, and people took it seriously at the time because I guess it's in the City of God by St. Augustine. So sometimes that's a manuscript question, and I've dealt a lot with I'm an amateur, but I've dealt a lot with manuscript research, probably more than the average person, not as much as some of these highfalutin scholars. But even then, some of them, they don't really. I've read books in which they, scholars will kind of say, for example, the whole question about Gennadius of Marseille, and this is it's ridiculous. Where you'll read Sienski, who was the one who wrote the book on the Filioque, the history of the Filioque, Sienski, I can't remember his name, and he says Gennadius taught the Filioque, and he quotes, 2 or 3, books. Well, if you look at the early manuscripts, it's wrong. Gennadius of Marseille did not teach the Filioque. The Ecclesiastical Dogma, the book he wrote, the Filioque is not in the earliest manuscripts. So, people don't go to the manuscripts, or people don't even go to some of the much more critical editions. If you just go to Jorgens, or you go to the Enchiridion of Dinziger.
Okay.
Like if you look in the earlier editions of Dinziger, he's like including the Filioque in the Nicene, in the Creed at Constantinople I, without any brackets or anything. But then you get progressive editions; they put more and more brackets, they put things in italics, all the rest. And when you see brackets and italics and things like that in Dinziger, it means it's not in the original text. It's not in the oldest manuscripts.
I think to answer, because I just saw his comment, he appreciates it. We appreciate the question. The question is, if you have experience in studying Plato's philosophy, I would say this: because I'm not even sure of the context here, do Plato's forms in the context you're thinking of help make larger the idea of God? And what I mean by that is, do they help glorify the logoi? Do they help glorify, do they help glorify the logos? Do they help glorify Christ? If they do, then the answer is, I would say that they are. I'm not sure, but I would say that I would not constrain them to the limits that were placed by Plato, because they're always going to be greater. Our church has always taught in terms of apophatic and cataphatic theology, and if we're applying, the Eastern forms, we must look apophatically, and we must say, does this define God, or does it show that he is greater than the definition? If the answer to the question is yes, then I'll say yeah to it. But if not, we have to dig deep and look at what the fathers say themselves.
Okay.
So, in any case,
should we go over Rule 5 of the? Yeah,
we may as well. We finally got here. I'm glad, and keep asking questions. We're here for another hour.
Okay. Rule 5 of Orthodox Apologetics is: if it's not clear from previous rules, proof texting is a terrible form of argument. Proof texting is often not only misquoting, but relies on the arguments of the original proofer, thus making ignorance spread. Use primary sources, or you will never get the gist of real arguments. I could not agree more with this, Father.
Tell me more.
This goes back to the thing I wrote on NFTU about the manuscripts concerning Pope St. Damasus in the 390s or 380s and Gennadius of Marseille. That you have scholars quoting scholars. There's this incestuous requotation of each other, where that's the only way I can think of it, where they're like, and it's producing this deformed monster of what the fathers teach.
The kids these days say echo chamber.
Pardon me?
The kids these days, they say echo chamber.
Echo chamber, but the point is, if you don't look at the primary source, and then if the primary source isn't clear, or if it's still kind of iffy, I think going to the manuscript. And we can do that now more. You could not do that 20 years ago. Heck, you couldn't even have done that 10 years ago. I mean, back in 2008, a lot of things weren't digitized. At this point, we have access to literally tens of thousands. You go on the Vatican digitize. For some reason, I guess they don't care anymore. They're doing it for whatever reason, but not just the Vatican sites, other, universities. I would guarantee you probably have at least 100,000, if not maybe up to 1 million digitized manuscripts at this point. It's so many that when there was one time about a year ago, I was just going on these sites, and it was this one site had like 10,000 digitized manuscripts, and I was just randomly looking through things, and that's how I found out. Randomly, I found a manuscript of Gennadius of Marseille where he doesn't teach the filioque, and then I began to get more and more interested in the question. All right, so. There's so much now we're to the point where there's so much primary source material that one person cannot go through that in their entire lifetime.
Yeah.
So proof texting, that's out the window. This is going to be the age of not just primary printed source text, which are great if they're especially critical editions, but going right to the original manuscript. If I had wanted to look at manuscripts of Gennadius of Marseille back in 1900, being in my same position, it never would have happened. No. I would have had to go into something like 20 or 30 libraries to make comparisons in Europe. I would have had to get permission to look at books. Many of those books were they didn't like people opening those books, not because they were necessarily trying to hide things, but because you can destroy a book if you mess around with it. So we're living in there's been a lot of evil because of the whole internet stuff and things.
But this is one of the things this is one of the great things.
Exactly. The amount of good, now the amount of evil that abounds is great, but the potential for good is just unimaginable. And so, it's not technology which is the bad, it's how people use the technology.
Right.
So, I think that's a very important point. I've been recently trying to find the earliest manuscripts of St. Augustine from the early 600s. They've not been digitized yet, and that's one of the things I've been trying to contact people in Italy who live in Milan to say, can you go to the library there? Can you take a picture of this page for me and such? But you even find this to talk about primary sources again when we have the whole debate about Saint Isidore of Seville in one of his works. All right, and in one of the works of Saint Isidore of Seville, he is quoted as saying, "The Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father and the Son." Well, if you look at the printed Latin text from the supposed critical editions, they do say that. But then if you begin looking, so this tells you not all critical editions are useful, because if you look at the original manuscripts, you don't find that.
No,
so even sometimes critical editions are just going to give a majority reading. Now, the reason that's dangerous is that if you have such a controversial issue like the Filioque, and even if you have 20 manuscripts of one work by Saint Isidore of Seville, and if only 3 of those don't have the Filioque in it, and they're early, or even if they're contemporaneous with other manuscripts, why would we give priority to those manuscripts? Because the Filioque is a later debated issue, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
right?
No, absolutely.
So, people would have said absolutely not. You won't find this. Saint Isidore of Seville teaches the Filioque. Well, from more and more as we're discovering, that is just not the case. For example, in Saint Isidore of Seville's book 2, I believe, of De Differentiis Rerum, in section 3, it's called Inter Personam, and you can find it in Patrologia Latina, volume 83. And in it, Saint Isidore is made to say, "Spiritus Sanctus nec factus nec natus sed ex patre filioque procedens est," or he's saying the Holy Ghost neither made nor begotten, but from the Father and the Son proceeding. However, if you look in many medieval manuscripts from like the 700s, well, he doesn't say that. He says instead, "Spiritus vero sanctus nec factus nec natus sed ex patre procedens est." In other words, he says, in truth, the Holy Ghost neither made nor begotten, but from the Father he is proceeding. All right. So that's an important thing to point that out. And when I discovered that, I was like, I was reading through just some Carolingian manuscripts or from the mid 700s. I know people think that's impossible. Why? I mean, I'm that kind of person. I think, oh, that's interesting. Let's know what we're going to find. And I was just looking through this work of Saint Isidore, and there it is. And whenever I find things like that, I know this is going to sound bad, but there was this, it's almost like you say, of course someone later interpolated it.
Yeah.
It's like, to use the old, I know it sounds bad, to use the analogy, like you finally put the sunglasses on, so you finally realize, pardon me?
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's and so at this point, I'm not really surprised when I begin finding more and more of these interpolations.
All right. So now we've got another question. We're going to go, we have 2 questions actually. So we're going to start with Dale's because his showed up first. During the course of the Great Schism, plus minus 200 years around 1054, do you assume malicious intent on the part of the Latins, or rather opportunism and or confusion and alienation from one another?
May I answer this question first, Father?
Please go ahead.
When we talk about the Latins, the problem is that it's such a generic term at 1054 that some have malicious intent and some didn't. On the part of when the Great Schism actually happened in 1054, if you look at Cardinal Humbart and Hildebrand, there was definitely malicious intent.
Well, this is what, if I may interrupt you, because I know you have a good explanation and I want to hear it, but generally, based on, if you've watched other videos on our channel, specifically the one Who Invented the Roman Catholic Church, the point is, the whole 200 years thing, even though there were crises going around 1054 itself, that entire 30, 40-year period before and after was itself really crazy. Okay, that was all I wanted to say.
Oh no, I want you to elaborate on that. I've been talking enough, Father. Why was it crazy in the period leading up to 1054 and after?
Well,
just give the short analysis.
Well, the short version of the story is very simple. That at that time there was a power struggle in Rome over, in terms of who was going to take the papacy. Like, anti-popes abound. You can watch this in the video. There's, popes, anti-popes. We don't know which one's the real pope. And back then, they really didn't know which one was the real pope. But in any case, by the time you get to Cardinal Humbert, who was a close collaborator with Hildebrand, who's also known as Pope Gregory VII, but we would refer to him as an anti-pope. Basically, it's Latin versus Latin. Like, I consider myself an Orthodox Latin. I'm Western Rite. So, I think that in that time, there were people just like me. But the point is, there was a new movement, and it was, basically the creation of the Dictatus Papae by Gregory VII, Hildebrand, terrified and shocked a lot of the Western world that would have been known as Orthodox, because even though the Great Schism happened, there were still people trying to fix it. And remember, we don't live in an age of instant information. People were sending letters back and forth. And so the whole point is, I don't see it as, the Latins being malicious to the Greeks. We know that's not true, because if you look at Pope Clement III, who was probably the real pope, even though he's referred to now as an anti-pope, he was trying to reach out to the East, and he was trying to stop this. But the point is, then the First Crusade came around, and that's when Urban II, one of Hildebrand's disciples, basically said we need to go to war. The Byzantine emperor agreed with it, and the legitimate pope might have very well just been killed off.
Well, the other point is, when we say the Latins, which Latins? I think that's the other bigger point.
Yeah.
For example, were the Latins in Ravenna hostile? Well, Wiebert, who later became Clement III, this doesn't mean they were correct about a lot of things. They probably have their own problems and they had to be solved. But it does seem interesting that Wiebert slash Clement III, who was the opponent to kind of Hildebrand, was looking to actually have a discussion with the then Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. And he wasn't trying to say you have to obey me and enter into community. He was actually begging for discussion. All right. So now compare that to Hildebrand and the others who thunder like almost their Zeus on Mount Olympus to us peasants down here. You must do whatever we say. All right.
The Pope's name is the only name in the world.
Exactly. So, it really depends on what you mean by the Latins. Now he says 200 years or plus or minus in the period leading up to the Great Schism. I think that's also complicated, because there was still communion between the Eastern Patriarchates and Rome. And it wasn't just a situation, let's say in the A900s, where Constantinople was only in communion with Rome, but not, it would be ridiculous to say they held communion with Rome, but not with the bishops under it. There doesn't seem to be any mention of breaks in communion during that period. Occasionally, I think there was one year break back in 912 or 913 between Christopher and Pope Christopher and one of the patriarchs. But even in the 850s and 60s, it's rather interesting because Nicholas the First was actually becoming unpopular in the West because of how he was behaving and acting in relation to the other metropolitan centers in the West. For example, he was, basically deposing people, either without a council, without calling them, or with, kind of a rubber stamp council. So you had, there were metropolitans and archbishops in Belgium, in northern France, and in parts of Germany that did not want to deal with Nicholas. They, when he excommunicated them, they they returned it. So, and remember, there was a period in which the German bishops and the German emperor wrote a letter to the popes in the 860s. And now this is in the midst of the whole battle with St. Photius as well, in which the German emperor and bishops basically say that if the Pope continues, the emperor is going to have to go there and arrest him, and then what they say is they're going to have to inflict on him what was done to Vigilius at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which basically means the Byzantine emperor. What was done to Vigilius was the Emperor Justinian basically arrested him. They say kidnapped, but he arrested him, brought him to the Fifth Council, and they almost tried him and they almost went to depose him, but he had to sign, had to recant. So they were willing to go that far even in the 860s. Definitely when you have the Ottonian period in the 900s, you have the Ottonian German emperor, Otto II. He marries Theophanu, who was one of the nieces of the Byzantine emperor. They were definitely positive relations there. I mean, they were still in communion. There are many cases in which you find that the Filioque had not even penetrated into all the liturgical books. For example, the Sacramentary of Fulda Monastery we've talked about, which is one of the great... Pardon me?
We've talked about it personally, but...
Oh, okay. Well, there were cases in which, you have the Nicene Creed still inscribed in Latin liturgical manuscripts to be chanted with music without the Filioque. And in fact, in many cases, they have it in Greek with the musical notation. So, it wasn't so bad that it could not be compared. For example, we have St. Adalbert, who was kind of an apostle to some of the West Saxon tribes. And in his life, this life of St. Adalbert, sometimes he's called Wojtek. He's not to be confused. There's this evil Wojtek that some people confuse with the good Wojtek. So anyway, he's not the bad Adalbert. But in the 980s and 90s, St. Adalbert was in very close interaction when he went to Italy with St. Nilus, who was one of the great Greek saints of southern Italy. And St. Nilus's disciples went later to Mount Athos. I mean, he's commemorated on the Eastern calendar. And from what we know, there was no negative reaction when St. Nilus met St. Adalbert. So they were still, there was a lot of problems, but I think the best way to think of it was a lot of the things that were transpiring in the West were kind of like movements that were trying to get started, but there was too much, if you might say, ecclesiastical inertia for them to really do anything. And especially if you have the popes in the 10th century, as bad as they were still willing to try to find ways to preserve the communion in orthodoxy. And even the Ottonian emperors, even if the Ottonian emperors oftentimes had policy differences with the Byzantine emperor. And during the Ottonian periods, the Ottonians made a point of denigrating the papacy's authority, in the sense of they did not want the papacy, and the German bishops agreed, they did not want them to have too much power. For example, John XII was one of the worst was one of the popes who lived one of the worst moral lives in 962. It was so bad that the German emperor, Otto I, I believe, had to basically go into Italy with an army and bring, a lot of German bishops and metropolitans, and they met with Lombard and, Latin Italian metropolitans, and they had a council basically right outside of Rome. And they called John XII to council, and he refused to go, and they deposed him. And they brought all kinds of witnesses. You can depose someone in absentia if they refuse to go. Now, you give them warnings, but if they are like, well, I'm not coming to a trial, you can hold a trial in absentia. And they deposed him, and they elected Leo VIII. And Leo VIII is still recognized, interestingly enough, on Roman Catholic calendars. So there's, and John VIII was later killed. He was, caught in bed with some man's wife, and they got in a fight, and he died in the fight. He was a pretty bad fellow. But that shows you that the concept of deposing a pope, that was not an issue. They believed it could be done. Now, maybe they thought, well, we don't want to make it a habit of it, but, they were willing to do it. So the spirit of conciliar metropolitan rule, even within a patriarchate, and so this is within a patriarchate, that was still very much alive in the 10th century.
Yep.
And, the Ottonian emperors and many of the, Anglo-Saxon kings, they gave a lot of deference to bishops, but they viewed themselves as being part of the church, because the church was not just the bishop. The church was the laity as well, and especially the king. The king had a very important role. And if they caught a priest, I mean, if the German emperor had caught in the 10th century, or an Anglo-Saxon king had caught a priest molesting a boy or a woman, a boy or a girl or anybody, and the bishop refused to act, he just hold a civil trial.
Yeah.
And the point was they want the hierarchy to do what it's supposed to do. And so they would shame them in doing something. If they didn't, then that priest is, as far as they're concerned, put in prison. So now later that began to change, but there was still a lot of this resistance. Now it's not always organized and and that's later a problem. And there were, of course, problems.
Was that the same John the Eighth that approved the Eighth Council? I assume.
No. That was John the 12th who got deposed.
Oh, okay. So we're talking.
John the 12th got deposed in 962. John the 8th, he died around 885. So John the 8th was a good pope. He was right.
He wasn't part of the pornocracy.
Yeah, he was not. I mean, the pornocracy all began to happen after the death of Pope Formosus. It didn't. I mean, it kind of. There were various factions in Rome that, like the political factions, that began to fight over control of the city. And that kind of, destroyed everything, for lack of a better word. But the 200 years were kind of rocky, but it was not so rocky that, I mean, even the break between St. Photius and Nicholas, that got repaired relatively fast.
Yeah.
Right? And St. Photius had, in fact, written letters trying to appeal to the Western bishops. And there's a lot of these theories that St. Photius had, in fact, allies in the kind of the West Frankish court, because they did not like Nicholas or, many times, in many ways, Hadrian. Well, Hadrian II, I think.
Yeah.
There was a lot of antagonism going on. So, but ultimately, St. Ignatius becomes patriarch again, and then, he passed away, St. Photius, and kind of Pope John VIII kind of repairs things. Now, John VIII didn't necessarily like everything at the Eighth Council. Basically, there was this continuous sore point about who should have jurisdiction over Greece. But generally, John VIII basically said I'd rather have communion than not communion. All right? And they agreed that you should not have the filioque in the creed. So St. Photius, I think, at that point said, well, let's let John VIII handle the matter. And as long as they're trying to do the right thing, I mean, it's one thing if you're trying to fix a situation as opposed to you're just saying, I don't care.
Right.
Because if you have a church and you got people in that church, that local church, and they're doing wrong things, but the hierarchy is still essentially on the side of orthodoxy, or that the hierarchy is on the side of orthodoxy, and even if they make a mistake, they're not trying to do it maliciously, you can work with that. All right. When the hierarchy goes bad, when the hierarchy basically becomes heretical, that's a different issue, and that's basically what happened in the case in the 1050s and 1060s,
right?
Where it was going to become impossible for Constantinople and the other Eastern patriarchs to basically work with these people, because they were making claims that the filioque had always been used. They were making claims that unleavened bread is apostolic. I mean, keep
in mind, this was only a sector of the clergy, but it was a sector that was growing in popularity.
Yeah, well, the Hildebrandians controlled Rome. And now, in fact, I should point out that after the time of Leo IX, who was the one that basically, Leo IX is kind of the pope under whom the Great Schism happened. There's a lot of discussion. Now, Michael Carolarius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, he did not believe Leo IX had actually written the anathema against him. Now, I don't think he's not correct about that. What's true is Leo IX basically was, they kind of made him a saint in the Roman Catholic Church later. But Leo IX basically, was a kind of a proto-Hildebrandian. But he kind of was, controlled by Hildebrand and Humbert. So whatever they said, he was going to do. And so he is responsible, obviously. And, he bears a grave judgment for that, anathema for that.
But it's possible he didn't write it.
Well, it's possible. I think he agreed with the ideas.
Yeah, but
so he had to ultimately give, give the sign off on it. And I'm not going to defend Leo IX. I'm just saying what Michael Carolarius believed. And the reason I bring that up is Patriarch Michael Carolarius is oftentimes attacked. And there are some, Patriarch Peter of Antioch, he was agreeing with Patriarch Michael that we should attack the filioque and unleavened bread. But he didn't agree with everything Michael Carolarius said.
No, and
but he agreed that he agreed the main points are the filioque and unleavened bread. Those are the heretical things we got to oppose, and we can't have communion if they're going to continue doing that. All right. So, but to point out something, Patriarch Michael was in fact willing. He was shocked with how Humbert behaved. I mean, not just to the emperor, but to the patriarch. Humbert had no humility. Everything Patriarch Michael did was in reaction to Humbert. They would, in fact, we have evidence that Patriarch Michael honestly believed if they'd actually sat down and, come out with documents and manuscripts, that he could prove the legitimacy of using only leavened bread, which is obviously ancient, and that the filioque is not right, either doctrinally or to be included in the creed.
He basically assumed that Humbert was extremely ignorant.
I think he assumed initially Humbert. He thought Humbert had come to Constantinople with good intentions, but that's not why Humbert came. Humbert came wanting to cause the schism. Now, and to be honest, Michael Carolarius had no choice. If he had tried to stand, if he had given up and submitted, then it would have been the essential destruction of the orthodoxy of Constantinople, and not the church wouldn't have fallen, but Constantinople would have fallen, or they would have gotten rid of Michael Carolarius.
Right.
So Patriarch Michael was like, I can't accept this. You're saying things I cannot accept. No, and I think Humbert knew that. Humbert came. He had to realize he wasn't that stupid of a man, that what he was going to do was going to cause a schism, and so that was what they wanted to happen. So They knew. So Patriarch Michael knew. I mean, people say, well, isn't this should Patriarch Michael have politically stayed in? Well, if he had done that, it was a lose-lose situation for Constantinople, for the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We had to do what was right, even if we were going to lose part of the West.
Well, now you mentioned, and I'm going to cut you off here because you did mention at one point, I forget which Byzantine Italian bishop, who basically realized that when dealing with the Hildebrandians, he basically said, you're anathematized like your father Hildebrand. Now, keep in mind, the anathema was a Western synod. That was a synod in Brixen. But the point is that clearly they recognized that this party, Humbert's, Hildebrand, so on and so forth, they were dealing with something else.
Well, there were, I cannot remember his name. He was a Greek metropolitan, Basil, in southern Italy. And he was the go-in-between, kind of the representative, because Byzantium still kind of controlled holdings in southern Italy. It didn't control as much, but, a few things, like coastal cities and that kind of stuff. And so Metropolitan Basil of Oronto, I think, I'm not quite sure. I'll answer Dale's question in a second. But, let me answer Dale's question. He's saying, what was their benefit in forcing the schism?
Oh, we still have another question, but the point is,
let me just finish, because I want to finish my point, which is what Dale was bringing up. Yes, the benefit in the Hildebrandians and the papacy in forcing a schism was that they could get rid of these pesky Eastern patriarchs. They could make the situation so intolerable that the Eastern patriarchs had no choice but to break communion. At that point, the papacy can focus internally on internal enemies.
This is the Dictatus.
Now, this is also what the Fanar is doing, I believe, too, by the way. So, so this is kind of people do this. This is kind of a repetition of ecclesiastical imperialism. When you want to kind of make a takeover move, you have to get rid of you have to force a situation in which, if your opponents try to remain in communion with you, they essentially bend over backwards and they submit. That's it. Even if they don't say it, that's what they're going to do. So they have to break communion with you because it's the right thing to do. But that's also what you want. So you get rid of the Eastern patriarchs. You basically say they're all anathematized. Then you propagandize that throughout the entire West. And at that point, the Hildebrandians only have to deal with kind of the proto-Gallican kind of Honorian / Clementine / Guibertine party that's like internal within Latin Christendom that's fighting them.
And they have military forces.
Exactly. And the problem is that the opponents of Hildebrand, like in Ravenna and in Milan and a few other areas, the problem is that they were technically in communion with Leo IX when the schism happened. So even if they didn't agree to it, they're implicated in it. So at that point, Hildebrand, at that point, they're people in Ravenna and other places are feeling like, well, we may have not agreed with the Great Schism, but we didn't necessarily immediately break with Rome over it. Now, some of them later did, but they didn't break at that point. So to them, it feels like, well, how are we going to go to the Greeks now when we're implicated in this? Now, that's a wrong way of thinking of it, but it's a political maneuver by the papacy to do that.
Well, and that's my point.
Now remember, in some of these, in the late 590s, however, not long after Leo IX died, you had, for example, Bishop Catulus, who I think was maybe the original bishop of Ostia or one of the sees around Rome, and he, opposed a lot of the proto-Hildebrandian. Hildebrand was in charge behind the scenes during even the 1050s, and so he was elected as like this counter-pope called Honorius II. And he was kind of like the predecessor to Clement III. So he was opposing everything. And Honorius II was even accused of some sort of, the Hildebrandians accused him of blaspheming the Holy Spirit. Now, whenever Hildebrandians say that, I am always, what do they mean? Do they mean simony? They sometimes say that the person denied the full divinity of the Holy Ghost. Well, what that generally means by Hildebrandian papists in the 1050s was that they didn't believe in the Filioque. I don't have the proof of Honorius II, but they made the same accusations against the Greeks. All right? So a lot of this we have to do much more study on, but one, at that point, it's an internal Latin issue. The Hildebrandians can then use military force to bring all the other Latin sees into compliance. Constantinople has basically given up, for lack of a better word, until the 1080s. The only reason that Constantinople began to interact with Clement III was because the German emperor was his supporter. All right, now, and the German emperor had a political alliance or growing political alliance with Constantinople. So Metropolitan Basil of Otranto in southern Italy, he had a lot of interaction with Clement III through letters and personal envoys. I think they met a few times, and I believe there was a lot of feeling in Constantinople that, well, Hildebrand has been anathematized, and this is the question: what were we saying about a Greek bishop in the Synod of Brixen? I don't think there was a Greek bishop at the Synod of Brixen. What I think happened is the Metropolitan Basil of Otranto and people in Constantinople were saying that, well, the Latin bishops in Germany have already anathematized Hildebrand.
So this is a problem that'll be taken care of.
Exactly. So they were already talking to him now. And remember, Clement III / Wibert of Ravenna, he was the Archbishop of Ravenna. He later got elected to be Pope in opposition to Hildebrand. So you had two people claiming to be Pope. One was like the one where Hildebrand, Gregory VII, whom the Roman Catholic Church recognizes. And then you have Wibert of Ravenna, or Clement III, who is kind of leading kind of the archaic conciliar movement, you might say. It's not quite consolidated to have a
we may as well just call it the remnant of the Western.
I think you can call it kind of the remnant of the Western Orthodox Church. I don't want to say they had everything correct, but they were basically representative of the old way of thinking prior to the Hildebrandians. All right, so Wibert of Ravenna / Clement III writes letters to a lot of Greek bishops. He writes a letter to John II of Kiev, Saint John II, the Metropolitan of Kiev, and now the earliest manuscript we have of this is from the 15th century, and there's reason to believe some things have been interpolated into it. For example, there was some accusations that Wibert was I think there was something like John that says, well, you have to give up wearing silk vestments or something, and some people believe that's actually an interpolation. But anyway, despite he made. John II made criticisms, and he said the big thing is the filioque and unleavened bread. All right, other things can be discussed, and John II actually recognized Clement III, whether it was right or wrong. He called him the successor of Peter and the Pope of Rome. So the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev was willing to say, well, at the very least, we're more willing to deal with Clement III / Wibert of Ravenna. Now, why? Well, because Wibert wasn't making these weird, insane dictatus poppy claims that he's Lord of the planet and that all the bishops on the planet have to do whatever he says. So you can work with somebody like that and kind of move them toward. You can work with somebody who's not that insane, and you can bring up manuscripts and documents and say you prove to them that the filioque is not correct if they were using it. I don't know, but you can work with that type of person and eventually get them to fully accept what they need to accept. You cannot work with a Hildebrand. So Wibert then begins to write letters to Constantinople and to the Greek bishops in southern Italy, and he receives what we understand to be positive replies because the Metropolitan of Otranto, the Greek Metropolitan, is interacting with him. But then things change. Who was it? Urban II, I believe, in the 1080s, late 1088, he heard about this. And he gets kind of scared of what's going to happen. So he convinces, his allies, his secular allies, to basically, kind of make a counter move and to try to get an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor. That is, they're going to. And this is the lead up to the Crusades. The German Emperor, was in fact exchanging letters with the Byzantine Emperor, and they were on friendly terms. The German Emperor wasn't really willing to send a massive army. It would cost a lot. There were a lot of reasons. He wasn't willing to do that. On the other hand, the French kings and some of the French bishops and in other places that were more allied with Hildebrand could be convinced to do that. So the Hildebrandians, I should say. So Urban's, he promises a crusade. At that point, the Byzantine emperor is more inclined to try to find some kind of connection with Urban II. Now they never have a union of church at that point. It's impossible. But the Byzantine emperor was political enough to kind of lead Urban II and the Hildebrandians along. Though the Hildebrandians probably knew that, and they had their own plans. Because if they could get a crusading army over there, and they can start taking over Antioch and Jerusalem, they might be able to take over Constantinople too and put a papist bishop there. So everybody was kind of using everybody, and Clement III/Wiebert of Ravenna, he gets left out in the cold. And in fact, the Metropolitan Basil of Oronto, I believe, had made some kind of reply where he was surprised at the change in policy in Constantinople, but he went along with it because it was the order from the emperor, and they had this council with Urban II. Nothing came of it, but it was all political to begin with. And so, at that point, I don't know how Clement III personally felt. I mean, he probably felt upset that they had, stabbed him in the back. And then the Hildebrandian military forces take over Rome. Wiebert/Clement has to flee Rome because they weren't themselves really military commanders. That was one of the advantages. The Hildebrandians had two advantages. They were masters at having money, a financial interaction. Hildebrandians had a lot of money, a lot of chests of gold they sent to places.
Yep.
And two, they had a military force.
There were strategists.
Exactly, they were strategists. They could play people off against each other. All right. So even if the Normans were antagonistic, people bring this up. They say, well, the Normans were antagonistic to the papacy. Well, only under certain conditions. All right. So if the Normans could be used or maneuvered into attacking the Wiebertines, the Normans would do that because the Normans were basically, let's be frank, they were newly converted Vikings. That's what they called Normans, the Norsemen, and they liked loot and money and taking treasure. So you can.
Hildebrand.
Yeah, exactly. You can use kind of like almost like you imagine like the Hell's Angel. Imagine like that's an army and that kind of type. You can use those people and they're willing. They're not too concerned about a lot of theological questions. And so that's basically what happened. And then Clement III kind of goes off into the sunset. He stays up in Ravenna. He dies.
His relics then produce miracles.
Yes.
So he becomes locally venerated in Rome, and so they have to get rid of him.
Yeah, and they later dump his body in the river, and they try to damn his memory and all the rest. So the answer to the question, they had to get rid of the Eastern Patriarchates. They forced a situation in which the Eastern Patriarchates knew they could not remain in communion. That gets rid of, basically, at that point, the papacy puts itself into a schism where they don't have to worry about half of the Christian population saying anything, because then they can just say, oh, those are schismatics. We don't have to care what they say. All right. Then they have to because if the Hildebrandians had tried to enforce a kind of a quote unquote reform and they had not caused a schism with the Greek patriarchates, it would have been impossible because you would have had German and Italian bishops riding to Constantinople, Antioch. There would have been synods in those countries supporting them. That would have been a political disaster for the Hildebrandians. And at that point, politically, if the Clementine forces, if they had, or the proto-Clementine forces could have just said, well, we're going with the Eastern Patriarchs. And that would have provided a lot of political impetus to the regular person. I mean, because if a regular peasant is told that, well, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem was a big thing in the West. People forget this because of holy sites. If they were told that this holy Patriarch of Jerusalem had said that Gregory VII was not the true pope and that Clement III was the true pope, then the regular peasant's going to believe, well, the holy fire comes down in Jerusalem. So, is God really going to be, not letting him, I mean, that's not the right way of thinking because, we can argue that, but how regular peasants think,
Regular people.
Yeah, regular people. I mean, regular people aren't going to go into these very complicated canonical arguments, even if we think they should. But if they start hearing all the patriarchs and including someone claiming to be pope is not with Gregory VII, and they already don't like Gregory VII because he's making the local priests divorce their wives, then they're going to go with the people who, the local priest George, they've known him for 40 years and they've known his children. And, They don't like the fact that the new guy claiming to be bishop is basically, in fact, in many cases, they were arresting the wives of priests and selling them into slavery.
Wow.
All right, and the children. So that does not make people happy. If this, if this local priest, everybody likes him, and then suddenly the new bishop, guy who claims to be the new bishop, he arrests the wife of the deacon and the priest, and then their children get sold into slavery or put into serfdom.
Yeah.
So, they had to get rid of the Eastern Patriarchates. Then they had to consolidate their authority in the Latin Christendom. And they had to do that by various connivances. They had to rely upon, let's be frank, the ignorance of many of the Latin clergy. They could celebrate Mass. They could do a number of things, but they unfortunately were not, outside of the Bible and a few books that they were given, they did not know a lot about the Church Fathers, other than maybe they had a breviary with sermons of Saint Augustine, Saint Chrysostom, and a few other people. But it was probably not enough to make a coherent argument against everything, because the Hildebrandians can say, we have these ancient documents called the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. They didn't call them Pseudo-Isidorian, saying all this stuff. We have the Dictatus Papae documents, blah, 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 blah. And so if you're a regular peasant or regular priest, you're put in a bad position. You don't know what to say.
Right.
And what are you going to do? Go to 40 different monasteries looking for manuscripts? You can't do that. And if you say anything bad, they're going to basically arrest you and depose you. There was a lot of problems in the West that caused this, like education and lack of knowledge of many of the fathers, even of the Latin fathers. And the Hildebrandians were more than willing to take advantage of that. Now, they talked about how they were for education, but they're for education only if they run the education. All right.
That sounds very similar to the public schools argument today.
Exactly. They want you to have education, but if they
it's indoctrination.
Exactly. If they get to indoctrinate, if they get to do the quote mining of the fathers, then they don't have to worry. It's just like in England when the Hildebrandians tried to enforce the quote unquote reform in the 1070s when the Normans had taken over. They realized that they could not force all the village priests and deacons to give up their wives. So Lanfranc, who was the kind of Hildebrandian at that time in England, he said, well, existing priests are grandfathered in, new priests are not. All right? And so the concept was eventually they had already replaced most of the English bishops except one. So at that point, you just have to wait a few years, and maybe 20, 30, 40 years, maybe even 50 years. And, you control the education system. There are no bishops that can do ordinations. Even if you have English priests that were going to resist, and there were some of them that did against the Normans, their bishops are all exiled or dead. So where are you going to get new bishops from?
Well, it's interesting because of the fact that
now many of those Anglo-Saxons, let's be frank, they fled to Ukraine, to Kiev, to Kiev and Rus.
Yeah.
Like the daughter of King Harold married one of the grand princes of Kiev. So they had already had, good relations with them. And that was because even in Scandinavia, the Scandinavians were more in the Anglo-Saxon orbit because all their missionaries, came from either very northern Germany, which was essentially Anglo-Saxon colony missions, or from the Anglo-Saxon area, So, it doesn't take much if you know how to work a corrupted system or not even, kind of an uneducated system take over things.
Well,
we're seeing this in a modern way with how the Fanar is acting in Ukraine.
Well, the reason why I'm saying is what I was going to say is that it's interesting because now that we have information that's much more accessible, so on and so forth, which they didn't have then, but they had a much better understanding of time. And what I mean by that is that Lanfranc's, argument basically, they knew that time moves slowly, and so basically what they knew is they just had to wait out the death of all these priests. And once they had grandfathered that in, then it was all solved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now,
and importantly, you have to control who is a bishop, because because priests can't make other priests, obviously. Right. So, and if you
Ukraine in the 20s,
yeah, exactly, unless you're Ukrainian from 1920, yeah. but most people acknowledge that was not going to do that.
Yeah.
Once you can't make other priests, you only got two options. You can do the all believer route, but the all believer route turns insane.
Right.
Most people don't go that way because then you start claiming the church is the church, even though there were no bishops in it for 150 years. Most people aren't going to do that. Or you submit, or you die, or you leave the country like some of the Anglo-Saxons did and go to Russia.
Exactly. Now, here's the last question. I'm going to jump back because we missed this one, so I want to cover it because we're at the end. Here, on the subject of manuscripts, can you discuss how many of St. Augustine's works have been corrupted and how we know?
Yeah. Well, I'm just investigating this. I think a lot of corruption started to happen in the 750s, 760s, really 760s to 770s. I have a tenuative theory that that there is one or two candidates, I'm not going to give their names, in the 760s and such, who got into the Carolingian court, and they're not saints. No one recognized them as saints, but they got expelled from one country for one reason, and they started causing a lot of problems. And I think they started. See, if Emperor Charlemagne puts you in charge of monasteries or episcopal reform, you can do a lot of damage. Even if the bishops resist you, you can just basically corrupt manuscripts. I'm not going to go too much into that because that's my theory, and I've been doing a lot of work in the past year trying to find stuff from that. But what I will say about St. Augustine is that you can find, in fact, manuscripts of his that have been corrupted. For example, if you look at Epistle 170 of St. Augustine, it's a joint epistle that St. Augustine and St. Alypius, the bishop, wrote. And they wrote it to a doctor named Maximus. All right, and he was like a convert from Arianism to Orthodoxy in North Africa. And if you look at, let's say, the modern translation of Epistle, there's only one translation of Epistle 170 that I know of, and it's from the Catholic University of America. And they use a later medieval manuscript, of course. And in the manuscript, the letter says, the Holy Ghost was not made either as creation was from nothing, but he proceeds from the Father and the Son. So he is not created by the Father or the Son. Well, there's a problem here, because if you look in the earliest manuscripts of Epistle 170 of St. Augustine to Maximus, it does not say that. What it says is, Spiritus quoque sanctus, non sicut creatura ex nihilo est factus, sed sic a patre procedit, ut nec a patre nec a filio sit factus. Now, did you catch that? A patre procedit. He proceeds from the Father. This and the Son business, that's added much later to the manuscript. All right. Now, in fact, John Mason Neale, who was an Anglican in the 19th century, he wrote a book called The History of the Holy Eastern Church, like in 2 or 3 volumes. And there's a lot of interesting information in there. And he was one of the few people to actually point this out, because I think he was kind of interested in manuscripts and such, kind of one of those weird people like that. And he points this out. And John Mason Neale says that the best manuscripts, do not say from the Father and the Son. They just say he proceeds from the Father. Adam von Zernikoff, who was this great, who was a kind of a Roman, I think he was either a German Lutheran, and he was trying to decide in the 1600s whether he should become Orthodox or Roman Catholic. Now, he went to Oxford and studied. He went to a lot of places and looked at a lot of material, manuscripts, books, and things. He was a very interesting fellow. His account. He was like a Polish, Ukrainian type fellow, like half Polish, half Ukrainian. He was a nobleman, and he was determined to say, what is the true church? He felt it could only either be the Orthodox Church or the Roman Catholic Church. And he felt, well, the filioque and papacy are important issues. So he said, I'm going to look at the filioque, because if the filioque, if you can just prove one or the other, because technically they were still Gallicans even in the Roman Catholic Church at that point, kind of this revival of a Gallican. So he started looking at the filioque, and he wrote a book that's not been translated into English, but you can find it on Google Books. It was called Tractatus Theologicae Orthodoxi de Processione Spiritus Sancti a Solo Patre, or a tract of Orthodox theology concerning the procession of the Holy Ghost from the Father alone. And he does a lot of great work in that. I mean, nobody mentions it today. I only know about it because Father Michael Pomazanski in his book Orthodox Dogmatic Theology gives a kind of a shout out to Count von Zernikoff, saying he collected a lot of work on this. And in this, Zernikoff collects all the manuscript corruptions of the Latin Fathers and of the Greek Fathers. And he is able to prove either he's able to show the earliest manuscripts don't have filioque in the Latin Fathers, and certainly the Greek Fathers. And he's also to show that when you can't find an early manuscript that doesn't show it, you can find all kinds of weird anomalies in the grammar. All right, because he was a Latinist, and if you're a Latinist, you can see there's something weird about the construction. This is not for a native Latin speaker who was like St. Augustine. This looks strange that he would construct, or St. Fulgentius or whoever. So he discusses a lot of this, and he has a lot of theories, and I've been trying to check them out, but I've been trying to find the manuscripts to kind of confirm Von Zernikoff's theories. I found the manuscript to confirm his theory about the letter of St. Augustine to Maximus, that it does not have the filioque in it. He's correct about that. The problem is that trying to find manuscripts of St. Augustine before the 750s, 760s, which was when a lot of corruptions began to happen, is extremely difficult. There are two manuscripts, early manuscripts of St. Augustine, that that are near complete editions of De Trinitate from the early 600s. One's at Oxford. It's not to be confused with the 12th century De Trinitate, but it's the early 600s one. And there's another one that's in, I think, Vercelli in Italy. And they're not digitized. So I'm in a situation where I can't, I'm trying. It's very difficult to find them. But I agree. There are definitely manuscript corruptions. I will give you another example. There's something that called the Libellus of St. Augustine. And let me pull it up real quick. It is a document. A libellus is another word for kind of a little book. It means little book in Latin. And it was a book written by St. Augustine, kind of a confession of faith he wrote, to teach orthodoxy. And if you look in the later manuscript corruptions of, are you there, Father Joseph?
No, I'm here.
Okay, I'm sorry. But if you look in the later manuscript editions of the Libellus of St. Augustine, again, for the Orthodox faith and against heresies, it has the filioque in it. But if you look in the earliest manuscripts, it doesn't. It just says est ergo in genitus pater, genitus filius, non genitus paracletus sed a patria procedens. In other words, it just says, therefore the Father is unbegotten, the Son begotten, the Paraclete or the Holy Ghost not begotten, but the Paraclete is from the Father proceeding. And in the previous line, he says that the Spirit also is the Paraclete, who is himself not the Father, nor the Son, but from the Father proceeds. End of quote. All right. Later manuscripts corrupt that. So it's very interesting.
So there's a lot of corruptions, but we
Yes.
haven't even touched the surface.
Yes. Now, I think we should still be prepared to say that that maybe St. Augustine didn't in fact have filioque language, and we should deal with that, because even when we deal with that, we have to prove, is this the later filioque understanding? If you know what I mean.
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
And remember, in De Trinitate, if you read a lot of works of St. Augustine, like De Trinitate and the City of God, one of the things that strikes me is he is extremely humble. He says, I may be wrong about some of the things I'm going to say. If I'm wrong, it's the church and the Father. It's the church that decides. He says, I don't want anybody to take my words as if they are the inspired by the Holy Spirit. I'm going to try my best. Like in De Trinitate, he was writing against the Arians. And so he admitted, in fact, he went to 2 or 3 manuscript editions of that because he destroyed some of the early works because he didn't like them. However, people stole some of the earlier manuscripts, all right, before he could destroy all of them. And he complained that many of them were corrupted, or they expressed ideas that he no longer agreed with, all right? Wow. So this puts this issue that maybe he did say something, and then later maybe another bishop said, oh, Augustine, maybe you shouldn't say that. And maybe he was like, well, you're right, all right? And then, remember, St. Augustine dies in Hippo when it's under siege by the Arian Visigoths. And, the Visigoths take over and they begin to destroy a bunch of stuff. So even when people are going to get surviving manuscripts out, are they going to be previous manuscripts St. Augustine, didn't get to correcting? Or are they going to be ones that were burnt and then people are going to be reconstructing them? And people think, oh, you're going too far. But considering the other problems we've seen in some of the manuscripts of the fathers, this is not beyond belief. All right?
This is something we have to do.
Yes, it does not mean all of St. Augustine is corrupted, but when you start to look at some of these issues, we have to be very careful. All right, we have to. On the one hand, there's got to be, and a lot of people who are into kind of the ecumenical movement, which we're against, they don't care about this, because if we were able to prove, hypothetically, that these are all interpolations of St. Augustine, or even a large majority of them were, then the whole thesis about, well, there was always a dogmatic difference between East and West, and we can have union without dogma. It completely falls apart. And this is what that Father Anastasios Gotsopoulos pointed out. I know we're coming to the end of our period, but I hope I answered that question about manuscripts.
No, I think you did. And Google Father Anastasios Gotsopoulos. His work is.
I put it up on. It's up on NFTU if anybody wants it. We can put it in the links to this later.
Yeah, we should put it in the links to this. We should put it on the War Room in the War Zone. We know many people came from that. This was a great session, a great first session. And we're planning to do this more weekly, probably not on Friday night, on Saturday, but we're gonna,
Tuesday 8 o'clock, Tuesday 9 o'clock, maybe.
All right. Well,
I'm going to announce it. Well, we got about 2 minutes. I would like also to point out that at the Council of Florence, St. Mark of Ephesus brought up this whole manuscript corruption of the Latin Fathers. And he brought it up because he had seen when the papists were bringing forward Greek fathers, St. Mark of Ephesus, could immediately point out where the people that added the word, proceeds from the Father and the Son or something like that. All right. So St. Mark of Ephesus, even though he was working with Greek translations of St. Gregory Dialogus and St. Augustine, he was even under that impetus, without having manuscripts, he was able to point out a lot. Like, for example, remember, St. Mark of Ephesus said that he quoted St. Augustine's letter to Fortunatus, in which St. Augustine says that nothing I say is to be taken as dogma if it's against the fathers or it's against the scriptures. All right. So, that's how we should treat the fathers. Not one, again, context, like we spoke about earlier. Well, don't take one or two fathers. Take the whole impetus. Take the whole consensus of the fathers, like Saint Vincent of Lorence. And in fact, it's very interesting. Saint Vincent of Lorence gives this argument in a case in which the church later found against him, but not at the point. So Saint Vincent was he's kind of prophetically speaking that even when he gives an example of a teaching that's contained in his commonatory about whether baptism can be repeated or not if it's from a heretic, Saint Vincent believed that even if a heretic does a baptism exactly like the church does, it should never be repeated. Although the church later did not adopt that position. Right. So you see the Holy Ghost working through all these fathers so that they put all these like Easter eggs, you might say, or kind of time bombs in a certain sense, in their works to make sure people understand what to take and what not to take.
And with that, we can say that is definitely a reinstatement of rule number 5, that proof texting is a terrible form of argument, and always look at the original documents if you can.
Yep. Okay, Father Joseph, it was great talking. I apologize for any mistakes I've made. Oh,
no, I made a mistake in the chat. I totally confused, John the 8th with John the 12th, so... Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right, so, we're not perfect, but we do what we do. We'll be back next week. Thank you, everyone who was here. Thanks for your questions. We really appreciate it. We want more. And I guess we'll sign off.
Okay, thank you.
Benedicite.
Benedicite.